Welcome to a new episode of Aftermath. We're on lesson 47 in our algebra books. This lesson is on percents. Now we're going to talk about percents greater than 100, but before we do, let's talk a little bit about what a percent is. And so that means we get a Latin lesson for the day. So you come for the math, but you get the Latin for free. The word percent literally means by the hundred. Centum means 100 in Latin, so percent is by the hundred. And so a percent is just a hundredth of something. For example, 37% is 37 100ths of something. And so a lot of times when we work out a problem by hand, we'll want to change a percentage to a fraction so that we can do that. And we're going to do that in our problem right here. We're going to start with just a basic percentage problem. This one says 20% of what number is 15? Now, we've learned before that whenever we have an English sentence that we need to translate into a math problem, usually the word of means times, and usually the word is means equals. And in this case, that is what they mean. So let's write this out as a math problem. For 20%, we're going to write it as a fraction. Remember, percent by the hundred, 20% is 20 100ths. 20 over 100. And then of means times. Now, for what number? You just want to put any variable there. For me, I keep it simple. I always put WN for what number. And then is 15 just means equals 15. Now, if we want to make this fraction a little easier to work with, we can. We can reduce it. And if you reduce it all the way down, it will reduce down to 1/5. 1/5 of what number is 15. That's what the question is asking. And so we already know how to solve an equation. If we have a fraction times a variable, to get rid of that times a fraction, we just multiply by the reciprocal of that fraction. And remember, the reciprocal is just when you flip that fraction over. So what we're going to do is multiply 1/5 by 5 over 1. And it's okay for us to do that on one side of the equation as long as we do the exact same thing on the other side of the equation. We'll also multiply 15 by 5 over 1. The reason we multiply a fraction by its reciprocal is to get rid of it, because you multiply and they cancel out. It equals 1 times the variable. So that leaves just WN equals 15 times 5 over 1. And that's just 15 times 5. And 15 times 5 is 75. So the number we were looking for is 75. And you can always go back and check. 20% of 75 is 15. And it's true. It is. So we double checked our work. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and look at some examples. And since the lesson is entitled Percents Greater Than 100, we'll look at some percents greater than 100. Here's one of our examples of a percent greater than 100. At least it's going to turn out to be a percent greater than 100. We don't actually know what it is yet. The problem asks what percent of 90 is 306. So we're going to have to do like before. We're going to have to rewrite this problem as a math problem. But here's the thing you got to remember. It asks us what percent. We just learned in our first example that when we write a percent, doing it out by hand, it's good to write it as a fraction. That applies even when we don't know what the percent is. So even though I don't know what percent this is, I should still write it as a fraction of 100. I should just write it as a variable over 100. And I'm going to use the same one as before. I used WN before for what number? I'm going to use WP now for what percent. So in place of what percent, I'm going to write what percent over 100. Even when we don't know what the percent is, we're still going to write it as a fraction of 100. And then we're going to do of 90, so times 90. And we could write 90 as a fraction too. We could always write it as 90 over 1. And then it says is equals 306, and we could write that as a fraction as well. 306 over 1. You can write any whole number as a fraction over 1. The reason we would do that is just to make everything a fraction, maybe make it a little easier to work with. So we have multiplication equals 306 over 1. What we can actually do is multiply both of these fractions together. It'll be the variable times 90. So just like if I did 2 times x, I would get 2x. Here I'm doing 90 times WP. I get 90 WP over, and then on the bottom part of our fractions here, the denominator, we've got 100 times 1, and that's just 100. So we simplify this multiplication problem to 90 WP over 100, and that equals still 306 over 1. And what we can do is treat this just like a fraction with a variable. To get rid of it, we can multiply by its reciprocal like we did before. Now, 90 over 100 is a difficult fraction. To make it a little bit easier, we could always drop a 0 off the ends of them. Technically, we're dividing them both by 10. But the easy way to remember it is to drop a 0 off the end. And we now have the fraction 9/10 WP equals 306. And just like we did before, we're going to multiply by the reciprocal of that fraction, which is going to be 10 over 9. And over here, we'll also multiply by 10 over 9. And when we do that, good things happen over here. They cancel out, leaving just the variable, which is what we want. WP, what percent? And what percent equals 306 times 10 divided by 1 times 9. So it's actually going to be 3,060 divided by 9, which is down to 340 simplified. So what percent was it? Our answer is a percent. We should write it as a percent. What percent is 340? So our problem actually says 340% of 90 is 306. And it should give us a larger number, just like it did here. All right, we're going to look at one more of these examples. Here's our last example. This problem asks, if 75 is increased by 150%, what is the result? Now, this is one where you need to be very careful, because anytime we talk about an increase by a certain percent, it's actually going to be multiplying it by 100 more than that. Here's the reason why. To begin with, when you have 75, whatever it is, $75, 75 bananas, who knows, when you have 75 of something, that's all you have. That's 100% of everything you have. So you've got 100% to begin with. If you increase it by 150%, it means you're going to have 150% on top of the 100 you already had. So it's going to be a total of 250%. So just be careful. Anytime you're working a problem, when it talks about an increase by a certain percent, you should always add 100 to that number for your multiplication. So we'll keep that in mind as we write the problem. The number 75 is increased by 150%. That means we actually multiply by 250%. And again, we're going to write it as 250 over 100. And then it's asking, what is the result? What is the answer, in other words? So 75 is multiplied by 250% because it's increased by 150%. What's the answer? So just like before, it would be helpful if we wrote everything as fractions. We could write 75 as a fraction over 1. We could multiply it by 250 over 100. And when we do that, we will get an answer. Now, we can simplify here again, or you can simplify this way. Or if you're a glutton for punishment, you can multiply it straight out and then divide by 100. No matter how you do it, though, you're going to get an answer that is 187.5. So whichever way you work that out, you should get 187.5. So when 75 is increased by 150%, we get 187.5. So just be careful. Anytime you see that in a problem, if it's increased by a percentage, make sure you add 100 to it. I'll see y'all next time. Have a great day.